So you had this notion of unity, and of course, given modern communications, given better road systems, undoubtedly somebody would have done it. The British happened to get there at the right time, which was indeed the 18th century, which is when they really started taking over territories. And I would say William's book, The Anarchy, by the way, is a very detailed description of the irresistible rise of the East India Company during this period of the anarchy in India, when things were literally falling apart and the center could not hold. But at that time, you really had this company that was able to do it. There were other contenders in the fray. I've often argued that the Marathas were actually making extraordinary headway. At one point, they got all the way up to Calcutta. They were stopped by the Maratha ditch the British had built. They got up to Delhi, and they managed to essentially reduce the Mughal emperor to a sort of hostage who ruled in name but was taking his orders from the Marathas. They took a bit of a body blow in 1761 from the invading Afghans, Ahmad Shah Abdali, but Abdali didn't intend to stay and rule, unlike the Mughals. He just wanted to loot and go back. So the Marathas would have recovered, except that, of course, the British were able to trump them at it. So political unity, there's plenty of arguments for. And just to finish finally on the civilizational point, one is going to talk about tracts of Hindu pilgrimage. I don't want people to think this is, again, falling into the trap of a Hindutva argument. It's not, because Maulana Azad, the great nationalist, who is, of course, a Muslim divine, wrote at the beginning of the 20th century about the fact that Indian Muslims traveling on the Hajj to Mecca, whether they were Pathans from the northwest or Tamils from the southeast, were all regarded by the other Muslims, principally the Arabs, of course, in the Gulf, as Hindi. They were all seen as from one civilizational space. So the notion of India as one both predates the British and survived the British political dominion that brought it.
Both internally and
at the end, if anything, the one thing the British did that no one had done before was to divide this unity through the partition of India in 1947.
So the second argument often used by the Robertses and Fergusons is democracy. The British gave you guys democracy. You wouldn't be an MP today but for the fact that Lord Curzon...
I'd rather be a senator, frankly, but anyway. No, I mean, the truth is that if you really look at the question of democracy, it's a bit rich to arrest, torture, maim, imprison, transport, exile large numbers of people and then celebrate the fact that they're democratic at the end of it. What have you done to give them that democracy when you've actually attempted to withhold it throughout all this time? There's example after example I do provide in my book of opportunities not missed but deliberately foregone by the British to extend substantive self-government to Indians. In fact, the private correspondence of viceroys and so on indicates very clearly that the professions, the public statements of associating Indians with their own governance were only meant for public consumption, and privately their actual idea was quite the opposite. And we've got example after example of that. I won't belabor the point, but to give you a couple of instances, there was no question about the fact that when the First World War was fought, for example, Mahatma Gandhi himself and pretty much every other Indian leader decided to support the war effort. Partially, or one would even argue principally, because the British hinted that there would be rewards at the end of it, and the rewards, it was pretty much explicitly stated, would be dominion status along the lines of the so-called White Commonwealth. That is, the Queen would remain, or the King by then.
So like New Zealand, like
New Zealand,
Canada,
Australia, South Africa, Canada at that point exactly, etc. This is the spirit in which the Indians went along. And then there's his hilarious sort of yes minister moment when a declaration is to be issued by the Secretary of State for India in 1917, essentially making this commitment in black and white on the floor of the House. And Curzon steps in, very much like yes minister, and introduces a whole bunch of clauses that soften and condition and ifs and buts all over the place to weaken, to dilute the commitment. And sure enough, at the end of the war, perfidious Albion does not grant the self-government promise. Disturbances break out. We have the violence imposed by the British, places like Jallianwala Bagh, where they killed large numbers of peacefully gathered Indians. And the result at the end of all of that was a further setback which really could only be reversed by Mahatma Gandhi and the entire change in the nationalist movement from English-educated lawyers decorously submitting petitions which went straight into the wastepaper bin, into a mass movement and a popular upsurge that the British found increasingly untenable to resist.
But, would say Neil Ferguson at this point, what about the civil service? We have in Vikas here a glowing example of the incorruptibility of the civil service as trained by generations of ICS officers.
Well, I can give you a number of exhibits, and I do in the book, but you know, you have the sad stories of those Indians who actually did take the British at their word and tried to get into the civil service. I recount 3 or 4 such stories, every one of them factual and footnoted. One was a brilliant chap who came first in the examination civil service. They tried to mark him down during the oral interviews, but they couldn't mark him down enough, so he still made it to the ICS. They spent his entire first few years of service figuring out ways of drumming him out until finally he was expelled for a very minor infraction, which no Englishman would even have been wrapped in the knuckles for requesting in writing accommodation in the civil lines for himself and his family, and he was expelled from the ICS for that. The second example was a gentleman I read about in the memoir by a British ICS officer, a young man from a prosperous South Indian family, Mr. Chetty, who was sent off to Harrow and Eton and places like that to be educated, went to Cambridge, got a first class first, I believe, joined the civil service, having allowed himself in the course of his education in England to think of himself as no different from the English he was studying with. But he came back to India as an ICS man and tried to behave, as it were, the same way, and was absolutely treated with disdain because of the color of his skin. To the extent that he found, for example, that though he had official positions in keeping with the ICS status he wasn't able to exercise any of them because the English would gather in the club and make all their decisions in the smoking room or at the card table. And when he applied to join the club, he'd be blackballed and never get admission. And the poor fellow in the end shot himself because he could not move his career anywhere. And so on and so forth. I give many other examples. These were so to suggest that the British, in this great enlightened moment, created a civil service and did everything to steer Indians up. At every single thing that Indians got, they fought for. They were thwarted up and down and sideways by the British in these positions. And even the relatively enlightened, for example, the man who wrote this book, Fielding Hall, in the same memoir in which he's revealing all of these things, says that it's unacceptable to imply that Indians can be treated on a par with English people. He actually blames the British naivety, even admitting a man like Chetty. He says the government of India must be done by Englishmen. That's the whole point of it. And he's completely unaware of the irony of what he's writing. So it's very, very difficult to suggest that there was any conscious effort. Indians, frankly, really broke through in a big way only after the First World War, when the flower of the English youth were killed on the battlefields and the trenches. And suddenly there was a general shortage of young white men for pretty much anything, other than perhaps dancing in Paris in the 1920s. You actually had, for example, a whites-only policy in the Indian Railways, where every position from station master to ticket collector had to be occupied only by white men. But after the First World War, they had to expand the recruitment pool. And then, of course, these bright Indians with their high education and so on get in. I've quoted writers going as far back as the 1840s. To their credit, the House of Commons did frequently hear testimony on what was going on in India. And there was one British official who said in the 1840s to the House of Commons that if Englishmen with a tenth of the talent of some of the Indians who were being relegated to subsidiary positions were placed in positions of such greater authority over these people, then, I'm sorry, I've expressed it badly. I think what he said was that the Indians who have 10 times the talent of the British who've been placed above them, if they were given real authority, they would run their country better than we could, or words to that effect. So there was always the sense that the Indians could have done much more. The British overpaid, vastly overpaid, multiples, not of 10 or 20 times what Indians were getting for any government work, but 100 times, plus a guaranteed pension after 20 years, and of course the furloughs home and all of that. The English received, in terms of Government of India expenditure, which is from Indian sources and Indian taxpayers, 110 times the total expenditure of the British government on Indian nationals in India. So there's absolutely nothing to suggest that the civil service is something we owe to the British.
But, would say Andrew Roberts at this point, the rule of law.
William, the rule of law was applied with excessive deference and excessive regard to the skin color of the defendant. Again, one can give you example after example. You know, in entire 200 years of British colonialism, there were only 4 cases where Englishmen were convicted for killing Indians, and every one of them was absolutely egregious, where it was impossible to kick out the traces. There were, in the average year, about 200 cases of Indians being killed by Englishmen. Not one of them was convicted. One of the most common ways in which Indians died was being kicked in the stomach by their English employers. And this most extraordinary justification was drawn up by the British jurisprudence of the day, which said that most Indians were malarial and therefore had enlarged spleens, and that actually, when the Englishman kicked his Indian subordinate, the Indian was not dying of the kick but of a ruptured spleen caused by his own fault that he had malaria. So that was, and therefore the Englishman was usually either let off completely scot-free or asked to pay 30 shillings to the widow or some such sum. And I think the worst cases we could find were 1, 2, 3 days. There's a Canadian scholar who's done a very, very good detailed study of all these cases. And again, I give many other examples, but there's no question about the fact that race was absolutely, and right up to the very end practically, it was impossible for an Indian judge to try an English defendant, and so on and so forth. This is not rule of law, as you all would understand it today, which is, you know, the blindfolded lady holding the scales of justice. She has the blindfold one eye up when she sees a white defendant, and that's how those judgments were passed.
But, Andrew Roberts would say, what about the railways?
That's my favorite one, actually, because the railways were actually built in India about the same time as here in Canada. But what was interesting was that there was an explicit justification written by the